Great, so let's get started. Again, my name is Paige Arthur. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center on International Cooperation at NYU, and we've been hosting these monthly dialogues on data-driven approaches to peace building and prevention for nearly a year now. So if this is your first time, you're very welcome. We're happy that you're here. We'd love to point you to some of the resources on our website that we've been building about people and organizations that are working at the intersection of data and peace building and prevention. This includes something we're very excited about, a tool that we just launched, a new ecosystem map that actually visualizes the people and the organizations who are working in this field, what kinds of tools and issues they're focusing on. So I'm going to ask Robert, who's hosting this meeting, to put some links to our resources in the chat so that you can take a look. But really welcome to all of you. And I'm extremely pleased to host the dialogue this month on the issue of modern slavery. So in 2020, the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, who's with us today, released a report showing that slavery and human trafficking are present in 90% of modern wars, including types of enslavement such as child soldiers, forced marriage, forced labor, and human trafficking. And I think preventing and remediating the effects of modern slavery is a really important issue for peace building, especially as it often deals with some of the most vulnerable people in society, really where the purpose of forms of enslavement is to keep them invisible and to keep them unheard. So I really welcome raising the profile of this issue as part of our Data for Peace ecosystem. And I'm looking forward to this rich lineup of speakers who are really using cutting edge approaches to give voice people, to give voice to people and to make them visible. We have quite a good lineup today of 4 speakers, so I don't want to take up any more time, but instead just want to hand over to our moderator today, Branka Panic. Over to you, Branka.
Thank you so much, Paige, and welcome everybody from my side as well. Good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening for some of our speakers here today, because now we have a really global representation of different continents and different countries, and I'm sure in our audience as well. So we decided to dedicate this topic to modern slavery also as a broader topic. We know that, as Paige mentioned, there are many intersections with issues of conflict and conflict prevention and peace building. But we are aware that this is a broader topic as well, and that there are many actually lessons that we can take from practitioners in this field. And when we look into the topic, into modern slavery, we see always this shocking number of 40 million people that are trapped in different conditions of severe exploitation. And data about this form of human rights abuses and vulnerability is not always easy to collect, is not always available. So we are looking into different ways how maybe we can collect alternatively the data about this issue. We are looking on top of that how the community of peace builders can connect, of course, with this topic, and what lessons can be learned, not only in conflict and conflict affected settings, but also natural disasters, in other humanitarian settings as well. So in response to this, we saw this amazing group of researchers and practitioners, academics, who are looking into available data and new sources of data, who are looking into these new tools and some of the cutting edge data approaches to stop modern slavery. So our July topic, with our July topic, we have this pleasure to really welcome this amazing group of experts working at this intersection, specific intersection of modern slavery and different technologies. under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. So we will hear a little bit of machine learning, but also satellite imagery, remote sensing, and even natural language processing. So we really have a combination of different approaches. And we are really looking forward to hear more from our dear guests today. And our regular audience knows that we always start with introduction from our speakers, and then we leave some space for questions and answers. But before we start hearing about the tools themselves and how our guests are using the tools, we actually wanted to start from the problem first and make sure then we understand what the problem is. So my great pleasure is to first introduce Alice from Delta 8.7, and Alice is a project director of Delta 8.7, which is a global knowledge platform for the Alliance 8.7 that identifies effective measures to achieve what for many in the SDGs field will be known as the target 8.7. So first, floor to you, Alice, to help us set the scene to understand what the problem of modern slavery is, and then we will give a floor to our three dear guests, Doreen Boyd from the Rights Lab from Nottingham University, Gavin Smith from the same university but the N Lab, and Adriana Bora joining us from the civil society, working as an AI policy researcher and project manager at the Future Society. So Alice, first floor to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Branka. And thank you really to the NYU Center on International Cooperation for hosting the conversation. It's really my pleasure to be part of this Data for Peace series. So as Branka mentioned, I'm with Delta 8.7, and just a few words quickly about what we were set up to do. Our institutional home is the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. Now that's a center that's part of United Nations University, which is dedicated to research within the UN system. It's made up of 13 institutes and programs, and it's headquartered in Tokyo. So the Center for Policy Research hosts the Modern Slavery Program, which is a knowledge resource for the anti-slavery community with an emphasis on connecting anti-slavery research to policymakers and implementers, both in national and international fora. And I'll just quickly note that I use the term modern slavery. I think many of my colleagues here do as well. And we use it as a shorthand for all of the forms of exploitation covered under Target 8.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And just to list those quickly, to refresh your memory on that target, it requires states to, quote, take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025 end child labor in all its forms. So one statistic that anyone working on Target 8.7 will hear, I think Branka already mentioned it, is that over 40 million people around the world today are considered to be living in conditions of modern slavery. Also, recent research indicates 160 million children are exposed to child labor, half of whom are engaged in hazardous labor. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But what remains less defined is what are the effective measures that the target requires countries to take. And of course, to address the problem, you need to know who is affected and where and how. And that's how Delta 8.7 came about. It was formed in 2017, supported by the UK Home Office's Modern Slavery Innovation Fund. It's the global knowledge platform for the Alliance 8.7, which accelerates efforts to achieve Target 8.7. And the Alliance 8.7 is made up of states, employers and worker organizations, civil society, researchers, international organizations. The Secretariat is the International Labor Organization. And through our networks, we collaborate to build research and data to promote evidence-based policy solutions and identify those effective measures. But here's the problem. Data is really difficult to collect, and not just data about prevalence of human rights abuses, but also about larger vulnerabilities to and patterns of exploitation. So modern slavery, like many other human rights abuses, tends to be hidden. The forms of exploitation have different perpetrators, victims, motivations, and practices. And as a result, we know that the number of cases that are identified and addressed fall short of actual prevalence. So policymakers and frontline responders and researchers are all bringing their own experience, knowledge, and data and research needs to their work to combat modern slavery. Delta 8.7 knew of researchers in a number of communities who use frontier technology to address modern slavery, and we wanted to draw upon those communities for our global knowledge platform. So in February 2019, we convened a Code 8.7 conference, and over 2 days, a variety of experts came together at UN headquarters to discuss how AI, computational science, and machine learning tools were being used in the fight against modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced and child labor, and also how they could be mobilized further. So topics that were covered included vulnerability mapping and modeling, the use of ICT and government or administrative data, the use of Earth observation, drone, and satellite imagery, and of course, the necessity of developing standards to share data that also protects victims and survivors of modern slavery and respects their agency. So the Code 8.7 organizing committee emerged from these conversations, and in the past 18 to 20 months has developed collaborative projects and a shared research agenda. March 2020, the Computing Community Consortium, which is one of our partners in Code 8.7, hosted a workshop to develop a shared research agenda for AI against modern slavery. The workshop report was published last month. It's available on our website and on the Computing Community Consortium website. And it identifies several research streams to which AI and machine learning can meaningfully contribute. To advance that agenda and accelerate research collaborations, we are also opening membership of Code 8.7 to interested organizations. We opened applications in the spring, and we are starting to reach out to interested members. This fall, we plan to hold our first members meeting and identify areas for common work. So before I close, I just want to make one additional comment on the complexity of the problem. At risk of stating the obvious, these needs for data about vulnerability and prevalence and effective measures have only grown in the past year and a half. I started by saying that over 40 million people are considered to be living under some form of modern slavery. We can unfortunately expect that these numbers are, if anything, growing right now. There will be new estimates released this fall, so that's something we'll be keeping an eye on. The COVID-19 pandemic and its various short and long-term impacts are expected to slow or reverse progress that has already been made by our collective efforts. Just in June, UNICEF and the ILO released the report that shows increases in child labor prevalence for the first time in 20 years. That's what brought me up to that 160 million statistic I cited earlier. And those numbers did not include 2020. So that report noted that an additional 9 million children are likely to be at risk due to the pandemic. So more than ever before, the pandemic has exposed potential fragility in the anti-slavery work we do, including in researchers' abilities to develop the evidence base. I know we'll be hearing from a number of excellent panelists on that exact topic about the different opportunities and challenges and real progress that's being made in identifying effective measures and effective measurements to advance progress in all of our work. So I'll turn it over to them here. Really look forward to hearing their inputs on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, so much. And I did say that we need to hear more about the problem itself. We see now what the scale of the problem is, but I also wanted to start with your introduction exactly to put the network on the spot, because I think there is this overlapping work that you are doing at the NYU CIC is doing, and actually recognizing the importance of the entire ecosystem and the importance of not only understanding the problem, not only understanding the potentials of tools to be applied, but also understanding how much we need to work with each other and need to build partnerships and need to build networks. So I hope we come back to this also and hear more about your lessons and some of these experiences that your incredible network managed to do. But before that, let's hear about the tools. So I'm really glad that we can start today with one organization that is actually a member of your network. So Nottingham University and Doreen and Gavin were both part of the work that you mentioned and part of the Code 8.7 as well, that brought many of these tools and approaches to broader public. And this is how we learned about this amazing work. So with this, I will then turn first to Doreen to hear a little bit more, Doreen, about your work at Rights Lab on data and measurement. And I know our audience is very excited about learning about satellite imagery and remote sensing, and this is exactly what you are working on for a number of years now, and you can tell us how you are utilizing this work in modern slavery. And then also I know by preparing for this webinar that you are also doing this intersection with our environmental destruction, and this made me think about these potentials of cross-sectoral cooperation with conflict and peace building field as well. So this is the part where we hope our audience will help us bring some lessons out from your work. Doreen.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. I am attempting now to share my screen. And does that look okay to you guys? Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today about what we're doing in the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. If I may, I'll start with a bit of background about the lab itself. For those of you who haven't come across us yet, we like to think that we're home to the world's leading modern slavery experts, but the idea of the lab basically is to bring together academics from right across the University of Nottingham and beyond, and to build a large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery. So we have the, if you like, the freedom to test out, to explore, and to apply different approaches to the problem that we've just heard about in terms of modern slavery prevalence and looking at vulnerabilities. So the way we've organised our lab is into 5 research programmes, and I lead the one around data and measurement, hence my invitation to today's webinar. And so the data and measurement programme really is about delivering new and cutting-edge research that provides that rigorous data, that evidence and discoveries for the global anti-slavery effort. So in the work that we do, we ask the question, does artificial intelligence help us scale our research efforts? Does it afford quicker, more accurate execution of our research tasks? Does it improve the quality of the outputs from these tasks and the application of those outputs? And does it facilitate and make seamless, the take-up of the findings that we produce by those in the wider anti-slavery community? Of course, we can't work as a lab alone. We need to have those, as you say, that ecosystem, the connections across the whole piece, and that includes within, obviously, the target 8.7, but also beyond in terms of intersections with those other SDG targets. So as I say, I lead the data and measurement programme. And so the question that I have is, what is the right data in order to meet the challenge? How do we capture that data? How do we best analyze that data? And this is extremely challenging, particularly due to the often hidden nature of the problems that we're trying to address. So often we can't measure modern slavery directly. So what we're exploring are those proxies. You know, what are the indicators that tell us that something might be happening with regards to exploitation, or how do we measure those vulnerabilities? And then we need to look at how artificial intelligence helps us with that. Now, one set of proxy data that I want to talk about, that I've been involved with for the last 25, 30 years, is that captured all the time by our Earth observation satellites. So they're always orbiting and capturing data about the Earth. So what can we, or how can we use these data, and what do we need to extract from Earth observation imagery in order to help us with the piece? We know that Earth observation is a very attractive source of data. It's global, you can get freely available data, but we need to understand what we can extract from it to help us meet the challenge that we have. So what I'll do in terms of helping everyone understand how we're doing this is I'll go through a number of sort of case studies in terms of what we've done. So the first one refers to the slavery or the labor exploitation that's happening in the Sundarbans Reserve Forest in Bangladesh. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and what that means is that the mangrove forests that are there should be conserved for their protective capabilities for the country. But from ground data and people in the area, we know that exploitation is happening around the fish industry. So what we can see on the slide here are fish drying racks. So these are fish that have been brought in, and then they're dried out, and then they're processed to sell on. Well, all the people you can see in the slide are there unwillingly, so they are undergoing exploitation. But we know that's happening on the ground, but we don't know the scale of that. We don't know where that is happening in its totality, nor do we know how dynamic, that occurrence is. So we use what we call very high resolution data, where you've got pixel sizes of around 50 centimeters. So you can see an example of the imagery on the slide. You can see some real detail about what is happening. So what we were able to do was to look back over time to plot out where these fish drying racks were. And that allowed us to understand the scale of this particular labour abuse. So really simple image interpretation being used here, but it told us about the sort of potential of these particular data for what we are trying to do. And this is another example. This is for Greece, and these are in the strawberry picking fields of Neo Manalada in Greece. And we know again from stories on the ground that labour exploitation was happening. And basically, we can't measure the exploitation directly, but we can measure indicators that there are vulnerable populations in an area that may be abused for a particular sector or a particular manufacturing, if you like, process. So what we were looking for here were camps where migrants were living, and these migrants were being exploited in terms of picking the strawberries. And again, it's just knowing what features to look for in the imagery that we were able to map. We were able to combine with a model, working with an NGO that tells us where the most vulnerable populations are. And this sort of approach has been adopted by the Greek government simply because they were taken to court by the European Union, and the Greek government had to put an action plan forward that shows that they were actively preventing this sort of abuse happening going forward. Another example, which some of you may well have come across in terms of exploitation, is what's happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. What is particularly sort of harrowing here are the use of young boys creating tunnels to go and look for new seams of cobalt that are mined by artisanal miners and then sold on for use in lithium batteries and so on. Again, details on the ground tell us that this is happening, but we want to be able to map the totality of what's going on. And then also, in this particular case, understand which of these tunnels are actually being used and which are exploratory tunnels, which then have been abandoned and moved on. Because we don't want to overestimate the problem. So again, we use very high resolution data to look for the tunnels. And then we were using something slightly different in terms of a technique, and that was to use what we call synthetic aperture radar data. And if you process that in a particular way, you can see the motion of the ground. So our hypothesis was that if the ground was moving downward, then the tunnels must be in use because you're changing the basically the surface of the ground, and we can measure that to the scale of millimeters using this particular technology. Another example is the Bull Trench brick kilns in South Asia, and we know that bonded labour is particularly prevalent in these kilns, but again, no one knew exactly how many kilns there were, and therefore the extent of the labour exploitation. So we've been working with the UNDP Accelerator Lab in India to map every single kiln. We've also gone back in time to understand what drives the evolution of the kilns. And all that mapping now feeds into what's called a Geo AI app. So very much exploiting artificial intelligence. And this then drives the inspectors to visit the kiln to understand what's going on in the kiln, but also the mapping is used by local NGOs in terms of any interventions they may carry out in their particular area that they oversee. So really lots of examples there of the sorts of things that we've been doing. So I'll close with 3 points really in terms of what we've learned so far over the past 3 or 4 years while we've been working in this space using EO data. The first is that at this stage, knowing what to label on the Earth observation imagery for the AI-driven algorithm is still very much in its infancy. We still need to understand what we need to extract and how much we need to extract, and you know, all those sort of features that the AI algorithm needs. So we still need ground intelligence. So we need that local knowledge of what's going on, and then we are able to scale from that. So this is very much what we've been doing through the ASTUS project, which was funded by the UK Space Agency, where we've been working with the Ugandan government around this particular approach, i.e. how can we best use Earth observation and AI to support the anti-slavery efforts in Uganda. The second point is that the features or objects that we've been extracting from Earth observation data are always there. They've always been there, but no one's really thought about what they mean in this particular context. And that's what we're really excited about, is to take that forward and learn from others. This is going on here. These are the sorts of features that are important to map. Let's go and do it. So, you know, we've got to a point in terms of technology that we probably can extract all sorts of things we never really thought about in this particular context. So that's what we're really, really driven to do. And it's about those intersections, as I say, with other SDGs as well. And last but not least, our work very much benefited from artificial intelligence. But actually what we're still understanding is what the EO in particular can assist us with in our global efforts in terms of anti-slavery. So, you know, part of this is, of course, driven by the innovative analytical methods offered by artificial intelligence. And so the advances in artificial intelligence themselves should promote, hopefully, more work around what we can extract from the Earth observation data for this particular target. However, we don't need to learn, we don't need to start from scratch, because a lot of work has been done in different domains that we can then transfer into this particular domain. So, you know, one example is the planetary calculator by Microsoft AI for Earth. That work's already been done. We need to look at that and then pick out the bits that are going to be useful for the global anti-slavery effort. And hopefully that accelerates then that effort to enable us to meet that very hefty target of abolishing all modern slavery by 2030. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Thank you for sharing these very interesting examples. And I think we already have some lessons learned for the peace building field as well. We just a reminder for the audience, but for the speakers as well, we recently also organized a workshop, international workshop on conflict early warning or early action, where we also covered the issues of potentials of satellite imagery and remote sensing in getting also an early warning. So this is an interesting, I know, Doreen, for you as well, an interesting topic to see and to explore potentials of course, getting the evidence of the scale of the problem on the ground, then scaling the solution itself, but also seeing how we can avoid this in early warning. But before we go maybe in details around some of these issues, first I would just like to thank all of you for sharing your work with us in the chat as well. This is really impressive to see this incredible experiences that you're also bringing to this webinar. So I would like to remind all of you that you can pose your questions or put comments in the chat and questions and answers section. I will pick up these questions and then we will come back to them after we first hear from Gavin and Adriana first. So I will give floor to Gavin to tell us a little bit more from a different lab, NLab. And Gavin specializes, and I will read this from your bio, Gavin, in temporal data mining and machine learning, focusing on the development of novel data-driven approaches to predict and understand human behavior. So help us unpack a little bit what you are doing in your work, Gavin, and what the work of NLab is in tackling modern slavery.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen, 2 seconds. There we go. Can everyone see that? Yes, good. Okay, so yes, thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone. So my name is Gavin Smith and I'm the data science lead at the NLab at the University of Nottingham. Just to give you a bit of background on the lab before I get into the details about what we're doing to do with modern slavery. The lab is primarily about understanding human behavior, generally through the application of machine learning techniques. Although we have people with a whole lot of different backgrounds. My background is computer science, but we have people working with us from psychology, from economics, and as well as from mathematics and lots of different fields. And in general, we're interested in repurposing existing data for use in our AI methods and interested in machine learning for social good and understanding vulnerability in general. And obviously modern slavery is a key part of that work. We're interested both in the application area, but also developing techniques when we find problems with the algorithms or the methods that we're using. So we kind of do a cycle of, trying to apply something somewhere, finding out that there's some issues with it, making some changes, and then going back and reapplying that. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a bit. So for today, these were two of the questions that were posed within the document that was sent around on the invite. And basically, the question here is, how can machine learning shed light on vulnerabilities? Or how can data-driven approaches help to identify those hidden populations? And one answer we can come up with is to consider and understand the environment that enables modern slavery. And why might we think that that's a good idea? Well, hopefully it seems relatively intuitive. But if some people would like an analogy, we can think of an epidemiology example, where if you think about dengue fever, you've got an agent, you've got a host which is hosting the virus, but then you've got the environment that's causing the agent, in this case, the mosquitoes themselves, to breed. And so we've got this, there is actually a third thing here. It's not just the people who are enslaving these people and then the modern slaves themselves. There's this environmental factors that are making or helping to enable this. And so if we can understand a bit more about these, then hopefully we can both identify regions that are vulnerable based on observable indicators. Why do we care about observable indicators? Well, as Doreen has just spoke about, being able to measure these and give an indication of the size of the problem is very important. And one of those observable indicators is obviously what Doreen talked about, the satellite imagery and that Earth observation approach as well. And if we can, get a handle on these observable indicators that do actually have a good correlation or good indication of vulnerability, we can hopefully eventually work out or help understand which ones of these are causal and start to be able to disrupt them. Obviously, that's a longer term goal, and we can't necessarily see that, or we can't see that from repurposed data itself. However, in the short term, what we can do is we can look to identify and predict these vulnerable regions so that we can start to direct resources with well-known interventions, so either educational interventions or perhaps inspections. People are going around and understanding more about the problem, but also being able to intervene if necessary, without the need for expensive or potentially unattainable surveys. We can't go and ask if people are slaves. That obviously doesn't work in most cases. And so, we've got these two things that we're attempting to do here. So I'm sure a lot of people are aware of a traditional way of setting up an AI process, and how this would work for modern slavery is like this. We're going to have some sparse and some very expensive but accurate ground truths that we're going to get generally through surveys, and we can get those from existing surveys, or we can, in the past, we have gone out and done those ourselves when we've done some work in Tanzania, in Africa. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then we've got these, so we've got these ground truths, and these are our output variable for our machine learning models. And then we've got these input features, and these are the cheap features that are extracted rapidly from repurposed data. Now, what do I mean by repurposed data? Well, it's the proxy data that Doreen was talking about. And one of those sources can be the EO data. But we've also done a lot of work with mobile phone traces, so called detailed record data that exists, mobile money traces that exist, and along with other things. So we can take this data, it's messy, it's incomplete, and we're trying to find mappings between this and a strong signal to these expensive ground truths. So in the future, we don't need to have those expensive ground truths. And obviously, particularly as cities expand over time, we want to be able to not have to go and run those surveys again. So we're just trying to cut down the cost of being able to identify these vulnerable regions, while at the same time understanding that which of these features are indicative of slavery, so we can get some explanation as well, and hopefully eventually with some extra domain knowledge, some extra on the ground effort, come up with ways and to have better tailored interventions and policy. So what does this this kind of data, this cheap feature extracted data look like? Well, I'll go over it very relatively quickly. Well, we've got a city that's divided up into regions. Potentially, this is due to the cell towers. So this is where we've got the information for. And over time, we can build up temporal patterns. We can decompose these temporal patterns, and we can start to recognize which regions exhibit, say, usage in the night versus the day. And so we can start to pull out different behaviors that way. And we can also look at how people are connected. So we can start looking at, one of our researchers looks at block models, which is just a way of trying to identify groups of people, or in this case, groups of regions that exhibit similar behavior. So we can start to have an idea of community structure within what is the geographical area. So once, we can talk about how we do this for a very long time, but in this case, in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, this is a picture of an interface that we built. We were able to extract 144 features for each of the 452 subwards. And then we had a survey that was run to get us those ground truth data points. So before I go in and talk about a little bit more about how it's actually done, I just wanted to give you a flavor of what these AI models can tell us. And so some of the analysis in Dar es Salaam showed that we have this notion that areas of increased use of mobile money have a lower likelihood of forced labor. And so we're seeing here that financial independence is acting as a protection against enslavement. We've got increased risk is also reflective of areas with increased pay levels. And so we've got these economic masking effects going on. And we can start to unpack more and more of these different things that AI models tell us. And then we can go and, with people on the ground, go and explore these potential hypotheses in more depth. Because what we're seeing from these data-driven models is just a relationship in the data. So it's a correlation really rather than causation. And so we're wanting to go with our domain teams and go and explore that further in most cases. We can talk a little bit more if people are interested afterwards about the factors that kind of emerge when we do these AI models, but I won't go into too much depth now. Other than to say, here's a picture on the right here, some Earth observation imagery. One of the features that's interesting here is we've got factories next to these dense slums, and those kind of features can come out as indicators. Obviously, we have a lot of other different features that come out as well. So the challenges that we need to address that require both domain knowledge and often new techniques to the data collection and analysis are these three kind of pillars. And these are the three kind of pillars that we work on within the lab. And the first is understanding the best survey methods that we can use to extract those ground truths, because obviously our models are only as good as the information that we put in for our ground truth labels. And we've done a fair bit of work, as I said, in Dar es Salaam, and this was on forced labor. And this was going out with teams on the ground and asking certain types of questions and in order to elicit the information that we wanted. We've also got one of the mathematicians, Roland, working on some surveying methods. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then in terms of data repurposing and feature extraction, that's talking about, well, when we've got lots and lots of, firstly, getting the data in the first place, and the child labor in North India is work that was done with Doreen. And so I'm sure there's a slide perhaps about that you've already seen. But equally, so that's on the data collection side, but also we have lots and lots of different features, and how we can reduce those into, those more manageable features is something that some of the mathematicians are working on. Once we've got our models, then we obviously want to be able to explain how they work, to both understand and be sure that our models are predicting something in what we would perceive to be a correct way, but also to start to unpick and understand these observable indicators that we might be able to use then and explore further to understand perhaps causation, or whether we think they're at least going to be stable indicators over time. And unfortunately, as I'll talk about, some of the ML models often fall short. Right, so I'm going to quickly go through these just to give you an overview of the kind of stuff we're doing. I'm not going to go in much depth, so feel free to ask questions, obviously, in the time that we have. So for the survey methods, we've done a lot of work with street surveying. This is where we send out somebody who's from the community, and they go and then they are able to talk to the local people and get knowledge about the local areas. And this gives us a good range of results of different factors. We can ask things about the road quality, the safety, the affluence of the areas. And there's some examples here that we can talk about if people want. The downside to these kind of surveys, unfortunately, is that people often have very hyperlocal knowledge. So they'll think that their area is, so if they come from a rich area, they'll say the area is not so good, right? Because they perceive perhaps they're expats and they perceive they have a different background. Whereas if you go into the poorer areas, they say the area is actually not so bad. Whereas from someone else's perspective who lives in a richer area, they would say it is very bad. And so going and just asking people doesn't always give us a very good ground truth. And so the other piece of work that we were working on with the mathematicians is a comparative judgment model. So this is where we get people to say, is this area more vulnerable or more affluent or safer than a different area? And we get all these build up of these partial comparisons. And then by using mathematics, we can turn that into a ranked list and get a better indication, or a less biased, I should say, indicator. I'm going to skip over the middle section there, which was the data repurposing and feature collection, because we've heard a fair bit about it from Doreen. And I'm just going to say one final thing about the work that we do on explainable AI. So we've done a project on modeling vulnerability to slavery in Brazil. In this case, again, we've got these ground truths. I'm not going to go into the details of that. We have a whole lot of factors that we're trying to use to predict these ground truths. And, you know, if we group these into things like demographics, census, mobility features, and things like this, then we can start to see how much these variables indicate. If I observe them, they indicate that there might be a risk of slavery here. In this case here, we're looking at the origin of slaves. So we're looking at, does this area for some reason seem to generate or, you know, be home to more slaves proportionally than others? And unfortunately, if we were to do traditional variable importance, we hit a challenge. And that's when these variables share information. And so we can't really tell then, just from the repurposed data, if, for instance, if the demographic features are causing something to change in my mobility features, which is then indicating slavery. This is called confounding within the causal inference literature. Or it could be the other way around, right? Mobility is, these mobility features are changing the demographic of a region, which is then indicating or has some link to slavery. And so we call this the downstream consequence, the demographics being a downstream consequence of mobility. And the trouble with this is that machine learning models themselves will pick one of these relationships. So it might use the demographic variable, or it might use the mobility variable, but it might not necessarily use both, okay? And so we could get a incorrect conclusion with respect to the phenomenon. The explainable AI is describing the model correctly, but it's not describing the phenomenon very well. And so we can't use this to answer those questions. If I observe these demographics variables, is it a good indicator of why? Causal inference, unfortunately, goes the other way and says, well, we have to know these structures here, these causal structures. And if we know those, then obviously we can do the right thing. But in most cases, we don't have that knowledge at this point. We can get in domain experts, but even they don't have the full knowledge of how these variables interact. And that's what we're trying to learn from the machine learning. And so if we just give up, or if we just use causal inferences, we're going to find that this process is too long, too expensive, and we're going to miss lots of opportunities. So instead, what we're going to use is some hybrid approaches in an exploratory stage. And so we're trying to ask the question then, in either case, like if we've got this causal structure here, this demonstrate the demographics causing mobility indicating slavery, or the other way around, doesn't matter, would this variable be a good indicator? And we've developed new techniques to look at that, called model class reliance. So we can see the most that demographics can indicate in this picture here, the most demographics can indicate slavery, modern slavery, is out at the bar, and the little lollipop you can see there is showing the least that it could, depending on the ordering of our variables in this kind of causal analysis. And so what does this give us? Well, it gives us an indication of which variables are interesting to take to further investigation. If both the lollipop and the bar were close to 0, then that's a variable that we don't have to worry about. And so it's all about, in this case, creating a manageable subset with our statistics, with our AI algorithms, to then interact with the domain teams and then go and either refine the model, add some of those causal connections that we do know are true from different research, or perhaps having to go out and do extra research on the ground to understand a bit more about what is going on in practice. So I'll leave it there. There's a number of other pieces of work that if I can talk about, if people are interested in one or other aspects of what I've talked about today. But for now, thank you very much. And I'll return the floor back.
Thank you, Gavin. I see that we are slowly running out of time, but I didn't want to interrupt because there were so many interesting lessons here for the work of the Peacebuilding community as well. But for both Gavin and Doreen, if you can share some additional links about your work for the audience to learn from, put it in the chat. And I will immediately give the floor to Adriana to share the third approach now applied in her her work of natural language processing. And Adriana will tell you a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your kind invitation. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to share the panel with distinguished panelists. And today I would like to take this opportunity to introduce to you the work that we're doing at the Future Society on AI against modern slavery, which we actually called our project AI against modern slavery. So we're just gonna say Project AIMS. And before doing that, what I would like to do is maybe take a minute to introduce the Future Society. And the Future Society is a think and do tank that was incubated in Harvard Kennedy School in 2014. And we have the mission of advancing the responsible adoption of artificial intelligence for the benefit of humanity. And to do so, what we are doing is actually we advance policy research, we do advocacy services, training events, and more recently with the launch of Project AIMS, we also do product design and development. And in being able to deliver on this mission, we have key partners across academia, NGOs, international government organizations, and also other governments. So, as I mentioned, one of the challenges that we are trying as well to tackle, and the reason why we're here today, it is the challenge of modern slavery. And we heard already about the shocking statistics of the over 40 million people being enslaved in the world today, according to the Global Slavery Index. And out of those, 25 million are in forced labor, and out of those, 60 million are actually trapped in the private sector, which means they are now part of the supply chain of big corporations. And we learn already about the statistics. And when we look at the 10 countries with the highest prevalence in the world, the audience of this webinar is well aware that by looking at this map, we can already identify that most of the countries that are touched by conflict and war are also the ones that happens to be having the highest prevalence on modern slavery. And we already discussed today the link between modern slavery and vulnerability. And once again, we see here in this map how the highest the vulnerability, the highest the possibility of having people enslaved in the world. And we have countries here that we know that are linked with war and conflict. And while modern slavery alone is not necessarily justified by conflict, it is definitely one of the highest risks of pushing people into those situations because the lack of rule of law and security and this high displacement that those situations bring, and therefore pushes more people to be enslaved. And when we look at this map, we have a preconceived idea that, well, this is where all slavery happens. And if you are in one of those countries that is not darker in color, as in this map, you might think that you are not linked with modern slavery. But in fact, through the purchasing power that we're having as consumers, we tend to be linked with modern slavery. And that connection is made by the supply chain of global corporation. And this is the angle that I would like to bring to today's discussion. And we know that companies, global companies with complex supply chains are linked to this crime and to the countries that are already affected by conflict and wars. And instead of pointing fingers, what we try to, some of the research that I liked and I would like to quote here today is looking at the opportunity, and is actually quoting an unexpected opportunity through this lens of corporate helping in the peace building movement. And a great example, and I know Doreen already mentioned that, and I would like to build upon what she presented, is the cobalt as a rare mineral that is so important for our day-to-day life. And why is that the case? Well, more than 60% of the world cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is a country that has been torn by conflict and resulted in many million deaths. And the country's government estimates actually only 20% of the cobalt comes from these artisanal mines. And it'll be interesting to see how Doreen's mapping exercise will be able to confirm or not this government estimate. And in fact, in this, the ground truth that Doreen was also referring to shows that many children are forced to leave school and they are compelled in these horrid conditions to work. They're exposed to acids and they are caused injuries and diseases and very often deaths. And with this slide, what I would like to showcase is this link that I was trying to present before. So we have the raw material coming from Congo, and then this material is then moved to Southeast Asia, generally for the creation of and manufacturing of batteries that then are feeding the developed world for all the devices that we are using daily. The phones, the laptops that we're using today for this conference, the electric cars, the flights. And therefore, there is no escape from the connection that we are having with this crime. And any responsible business wishes to have nothing to do with these inhumane practices. Therefore, they are trying to create opportunities to showcase, we must hope, how they are fighting against this crime. And as consumers, for us, we would like to have that information so we can purchase while being well informed. So responding to this really shocking statistics and realities, the UK government passed the first national legislation where they are asking companies that have a turnover of over 36 million pounds per year to publish a statement per year where they declare the structure of their supply chain and the steps that they are taking to eradicate modern slavery. And similar legislation is now passed in Australia. And we have other modern slavery acts being now considered in Canada or New Zealand, or similar legislation in scope being passed in the European Union, France, Netherlands, Germany. So more countries are now following this pattern. So what does this concretely mean? That means that companies are complying, they are publishing statements. There is an entire discussion about the quality of these statements, but they are complying. So we have thousands of statements that have been published since 2016 with an estimate of only from the UK of 12,000 to 17,000 statements being published per year and thousands more from all the other countries I mentioned. So now the question is, how can we actually keep up with all these statements and really understand the level of compliance? So of course, we need a scalable solution because the status quo shows that to manually assess a statement, so just take one statement, read it, understand the content, try to make the analysis, and then having researchers validate this assessment, more senior researchers validate this assessment, it takes approximately 2 hours for one statement. So we need a scalable solution in order to really evaluate the level of compliance from companies and understand the impact that this legislation really have to drive change in companies and hopefully in the long run, concrete impact on eradicating modern slavery from the supply chain. So this is where our solution comes to place. So the Future Society launched together with the Mindurus Foundation Walk Free Initiative, Project AIMS, which stands for AI Against Modern Slavery, where we really power AI to try to dive deep into those statements and understand specific metrics. So we use data science and natural language processing to really understand the level of compliance, especially from the UK statements, where it just happens that we have more data as this legislation has been here for longer, and really try to create an open source tool and a lot of documentation that will accompany this tool that we can make available so people can understand the tool, but also repurpose it for the other legislation. So when we say we benchmark, what we're really doing is looking for specific characteristics of those statements. So we're looking if the statement is signed or if it's approved by the board of directors, which is actually the only legislation requirement in the UK, but also for the recommended sections of those legislation, which really ask companies to do risk identification, risk assessment, risk mitigation, identify incidents and try to explain how they're dealing with those incidents and what due diligence practices they have in place, the whistleblowing mechanism, training, or modern slavery policy at large. So those are the metrics that we are building machine learning to classify for. So the overarching objective for us, it is first to build this tool and make it available open source and really hope to reduce the time it takes to look at those statements. But secondly, we really want to provide policymakers and legislation and understanding of how those tools can aid them in monitoring and evaluating these initiatives, and maybe think about how they can create and co-create these similar initiatives for other non-financial reporting. And finally, we really try to get the top AI talent, software developers, data scientists, and even social scientists to think about and maybe even come and join us and how they can apply their expertise in the area of AI for good, but more specifically in combating modern slavery. So with this, I would like to say thank you, and I'm really happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for this presentation and for making these very useful connections with the conflict and conflict-affected countries. I think one of the questions that I wanted to ask you already answered, and this is this repurposing of your tool, the tool that you are developing. I think this is one of the very important elements that we realized in our previous work as well with practitioners, how important it is to put this work, when it's possible, of course, as an open source, and also think about applications in other fields as well. So as you said, this is not only for, doesn't have only a potential for processing the legislation in the modern slavery, which is very important and the topic of this conversation, but I would like to invite the audience just to think about other potential applications as well. I assume this will happen because it's only 60-minute webinar and so many lessons learned to share, but I do want to, if you can stay for a little bit longer, I do want to bring in some questions that we collected through our registration form and to ask something that was maybe already obvious from Doreen's presentation. And this is the question that one of the registered participants ask, how could and if machine learning, AI, and other tools that you are using can compensate, or if they compensate for regions where there is a limited internet access or limited availability to data. And then thinking about this connection with conflict and how often the problem of modern slavery is happening in conflict affected areas. And those are the areas where we usually don't have an access to. So is there a potential for some of these tools to compensate for that, whoever wants to come in? I guess, Doreen, this is already obvious from your presentation, but we can also, yes, I can see the hand on, go ahead.
Sorry, I was up and down. No, absolutely. I think the key thing is that there's lots of Earth observation data that is open source, so you don't have to pay for it, which is fantastic. And then, you know, so you constrain yourself and say, right, okay, if we don't have the pockets of money to go and buy the commercial data set, we know that there are some alternatives. But then you have to think about what you can see in those data, because they're not of good quality in terms of being able to visibly see some of the markers. But that's okay, you know what your constraints are, and it's still a fantastic data source. You know, it's updated weekly, it's global, so you will have data for your particular area of interest. So I'm a big fan of open source EO data. It costs nothing to download, but of course then you have to have the infrastructure to process it and to extract that data that you want. But more and more I'm seeing that you know, every country has some sort of expertise, whether sometimes it's in the environmental department of, you know, government or so on, not thinking about how it then transfers to this domain or to, you know, for peacekeeping and so on. I think that message needs to go out that it's universal, and there's transferability between data types and methods that we're all working with.
Thank you, Doreen. Gavin, would you like to add something to this? I see you added a lot of resources. Thank you all for sharing this. Gavin, I know you mentioned your surveys. Is there any alternative to this, or what were your lessons from your work?
So from our point of view, obviously, if you can't get people on the ground ever, you're going to struggle. If you do have data sources, say for instance, we're using mobile phone data and there's areas that that company isn't, doesn't have good uptake in, or because of other reasons, people are being suppressed and not able to take up those services, then you do have to do some form of surveying or some form of other alternative data collection to be able to correct the biases that we know are there. But the hope is, and on all our work is being aimed at, is reducing that effort. So if we can just make that effort as small as possible and make it manageable, then we get a long way further forward. So no, unfortunately, if we don't have the data, we don't have the data. Obviously, the satellite data is great because that's one that we do have, but the ability to reduce the effort in surveying is what we're aiming for.
Thank you, Gavin. Adriana, I have a quick one for you. We usually look into NLP as a new technology oh, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. So maybe it's not me.
I think Blanca's gone.
Maybe we can wait a second.
Yeah.
Longer. What the
We can hear you if you. Yeah, we can hear you if you wanted to talk a little bit more about NLP. Oh, I think she's back now.
Yeah, I'm trying to predict the question. But
I was kicked out by artificial intelligence, I think. It was a too challenging question. Sorry about this, Adriana.
No problem.
Just a quick one, because we are really running out of time. We usually hear about NLP and great potentials that are out there. Are there any unintended risks or anything that makes this work actually really hard to do and complicated to do? Some lesson that you would like to share with our audience?
Absolutely, yes. So I'm going to post something on the chat as well. We try to collect as closely as possible that we can our learnings by trying to do this process. And with this, as with any other AI building tool, we run into the issue first of getting the data and getting it in a structure that makes sense for the algorithm, but also we run into this very commonly heard of issue, which is garbage in, garbage out. So it's really important that the ground truth to be done very high accuracy and high level. So the longest part of our project so far focused on getting that data structure. And here we're talking about dealing with PDFs. And I know that it's a problem that is so commonly found across every other project that is trying to make sense of this particular format that is just so popular. And instead of having the companies publish those reports in machine readable formats as they do with their financial reporting, for instance, they are still using PDFs, which makes the structuring of this data and the extraction of the text and very, very difficult. So first is about getting the data structured in a very good format and making sure you don't miss any relevant information, especially, and how can you do that when a lot of companies use graphs and infographics and tables and make everything look pretty, but the substance is hard to capture. So that's first issue. And then as with NLP, as I said, as with any other AI project, is about the quality of your ground truth. So getting that ground truth as high quality as possible, it is going to save so much time in the long run, and will make sure that we don't exponentially increase biases or create more harm in the long run. So very common issues, but just can't believe we're still dealing with the issues of PDFs across so many different domains. So I would love to learn more about other people's experience with this, and I'll share in the chat our collective learning so far in this project.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Adriana. And at this point, I think we will have to close the webinar. I would not like this to be the end of the conversation, because I think there are a lot of lessons to keep sharing. So I will ask Robert to share the link to our LinkedIn group where we can continue. We will definitely share all of the resources there and continue this conversation. I would also like to ask everybody to have a look at the ecosystem mapping tool that Paige mentioned at the introduction. From all of your presentations, I really, my takeaway was again that we need to share as much as we can and what we can, of course, and to share our lessons and to cooperate together across sectors. So we today heard some lessons from academia and civil society. There are many other lessons from the private sector as well, from international organizations. We did this effort to try to map this work to show the organizations that are applying data-driven approaches to peace building and prevention work. If you're not already at the map, please add your work there if you wish to be included. Update your work as well. Some of the organizations who presented today are already there. And again, Alice, thank you also for sharing the knowledge from your network. I really look forward to explore the cooperation between the two. And I think we also have just the last thing that I want to say is this really intention to include Global North and Global South organizations. So Alice and I talked about this. This is an invitation for everybody in the audience to really make your work visible through these networks. So once again, thank you, Alice, Doreen, Gavin, Adriana, thank you, Paige, and NYU CIC for hosting this discussion. And stay safe. We will do a break in August, but see you again in September. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.